So behind us right now we have a next-gen Ford Ranger, and as part of our Red Arc dual battery kit we need to install sockets in the rear to power up our camping equipment. Now if this was an Everest, we'd be installing the accessory harness before we install the battery that we can see installed in its battery tray there, and that'll give us better access to the firewall grommet as we'll be mounting the sockets inside of the vehicle in an Everest wagon. But behind us right now we have a Ford Ranger with a tub on the back. So there's a range of different accessory harnesses laid out in front of me, depending on our needs for sockets. So let's jump down the back and we'll show you some of the options for mounting these sockets, and then we'll show you how to get these kits installed into your next-gen Ranger. Okay, so here's some solutions for our standard accessory harnesses to suit the next-gen Ranger. In the front here we have our surface mount options. So we have a surface triple, that's 3 round sockets. Possibly we could mount there. There's many options for these surface mount sockets. Just a dual or a dual with an Anderson. So there are our options that you can see on the website there. Now to mount these sockets in that location, we would suggest following the chassis rail, running our cable up behind this light, simply removed by these 2 screws, and then the light will pull away. We'll see our Ford wiring coming up there to power up the light. We can drill a hole through the back, and that'll give us access to mount our sockets here. So that's some options, and these being in a tent like this, they do make them quite universal, that we can mount them in many different locations around the tray. For instance, this would be our single plus Anderson flush mount housing. That'll fit perfectly in there, means we just got to cut out the holes for the Anderson and the socket to go through. A triple plus Anderson, we've got the option for 2 extra round sockets mounted in this side, and then our Anderson and single there. And that's actually what we're going to install into this vehicle today. So we'll show you how to get this accessory harness installed into your vehicle. So the first thing we'll do is undo the cable tie that's holding our loom together, and we can throw that cable tie away. So as we unravel the kit, we basically want to lay our harness into position at this moment, keeping in mind that we're going to be connecting to that auxiliary battery. We don't want to make the electrical connections yet. It's a matter of now routing our cable to the rear. So if we lay our cable in basically the route that we want to take through the engine bay. So what I'm going to do now, because I'm going to follow this existing Ford harness here, I'm going to feed the cable up through all of these things, keeping in mind that I want a cable tie to the Ford harness. So I'll feed it up through there. I'll see this little wire here on that plug just behind there, keeping in mind that I want to keep tying to the Ford harness, and just lay that into position at the moment. And just allowing enough length for us to play with over there. So just sitting it there for now. Now the next step is to find the other end of our harness. So I'll lay it out in front of the car. Think of the way that I'm going to route my cable. So I'm thinking I'm going to want to cable tie to this main Ford electrical harness. So I'll make sure I go beside that for a cable tie. And having the same thought in mind as I drop down towards the chassis rail, and there's a Ford harness straight down, and a lot of vehicles will have an electrical harness down here that starts running towards the rear. So let's just thread our cable all the way through. Okay, so now that our cable is pulled through from the engine bay to under the car, continuing to keep in mind that we want to follow things that we can cable tie to. This Ford electrical harness right here, perfect. So going from inside the chassis rail, I just want to follow the electrical harnesses that I can see here, keeping in mind I can cable tie to them. My cable's on the inside of the chassis rail, so the engine side of the chassis rail. So what I want to do is feed it up across the top of the chassis rail, and you'll notice a Ford electrical harness running over the top, and that gets our cable on the outer side of the chassis rail. And then we can start, you can see our electrical harness running around the body mount here. So we just want to keep following that past our Ford harness here towards the rear. Not cable tying anything at the moment, just getting our cable into position. So I've just moved towards the rear now. So right behind the camera is just the rear wheel. Okay, so you can see our forward electrical harness now starts to duck up towards the top of the body. So what we want to do is follow that up and back over the chassis rail to the inside. We're grabbing our cable like so. And the reason for that is inside the chassis rail now, we've got a great forward harness to continue securing to. So you'll see inside now we have a forward electrical harness and it runs all the way towards the rear of the vehicle. So we can continue to follow that the entire length. So once again, we're just following that electrical harness over any fuel lines, keeping in mind that we want a cable tie to it later. So we're at the fuel tank now, following over top of the fuel tank, continuing to follow that harness. We've got good access over the chassis rail. I can get my hand right over the chassis rail, continue following that electrical harness towards the rear wheel here. Now just the start of the tub mount, just got to feed it through a little bit until we can grab it at the back of the fuel tank. So you can see the body mount that we just ran the cable over here. So our cable's on the back side of that body mount. So we've got the fuel tank right here, our spring for the rear suspension there. What we want to do is go over this part of the body here, right near the tank filler, because on the inside of this chassis rail, we have a forward electrical harness again that we can start securing to. So I'm just going to thread my cable up here. So I'm starting to see the cable on the inside of that chassis rail. Okay, so I've got that harness now. I'm going to pull that cable through. Okay, so I've got my cable at the back of the fuel tank now. I'm just going to continue to push that towards the spare tyre. And I can see it's falling down just near the spare tyre. So now I can go move to behind the rear wheel. So grabbing our cable again from under the vehicle, just make sure we go across the top of the chassis rail. Following those forward electrical harnesses, we want to be on the outside of the chassis rail now. So now that we've routed our cable to behind the rear wheel, the next thing we want to do is remove this panel where we're going to mount our sockets. So just some Torx bits, undo all 4 of these screws. We're looking to fully remove them. And then we can remove that electrical panel. Now we're ready to jump back under, feed our cable up to here, and while we're under there, we'll disconnect the electrical plug for this so that our full panel can come away. Now looking up in between our inner tub wall here and our outer tub wall, we'll see that small cable coming down. So that's the cable we want to disconnect. It goes to a plug here. We want to disconnect that plug and that'll allow our panel to come out. So just pushing that tab in, pulling our plug to release it. So that's released our electrical panel from inside the tub. Now what we want to do is feed our cable up towards that hole and feed it through into the tub. We can reach up there. So now that we're back in the tub area, we've got our cable up to where we need it. Because we removed this plug, we can actually pull out our electrical panel. So the start of our install is to get our sockets into this location here. So the easiest way to do that is perhaps to remove our sockets from the housing. So just a collar there will fully remove our round socket. And then just removing the screws will release the Anderson. And what this basically does is just allow us to use our housing as a bit of a template to mark there. So we want to kind of centralize that now. Once we have it centralized, we're going to mark that inner circle where our round socket goes. Get that into position. We're going to mark those 4 holes around the outside. And while we're there, just going to mark out, get an idea of where our Anderson comes through. Like that. And then we can take that template away. And you can see we've got a bit of a guide of where everything's going to be sitting. Now obviously we need to take a little bit more meat. So this is a 32mm hole. And this we're going to take a little bit more meat out of to allow our Anderson to slip all the way through. So just keeping in mind that we don't want to go near our bolts. Other than that, we can take quite a lot of meat away from here. So I'm just going to draw a guideline and be conservative at the start, because we can always take more away, but we can't put it back. Just going to draw a line around all of our sockets. Start with taking that much meat away, and then we can take more if we need it. So just a couple ways that we can go about cutting out this area that we've marked now. So today we'll be using a nibbler tool, which is certainly an easier way of doing it. If you don't have a tool like that, there's other ways around it. We could use a drill to start a pilot hole, even a series of pilot holes, enough to get some kind of blade in there, a hacksaw blade, something that we can cut the plastic away manually. But just to make it easier and faster, we're just going to use a nibbler tool today, and we're just going to cut out that section that we've marked there. So I'm going to start in that bottom corner. And just push that piece of plastic out. Now we'll just see if we've made enough room for the whole housing to sit into place. And it looks like we've gone really close on that first cut. You can even inspect it from the back. So it looks like I might need to go a little bit more just to make way for the collar on that round plug. So perhaps at this point we can even mark it from the back. I'll just mark a little bit of where I want to take out there. A little bit there, and maybe we can even cut this from the back side. Okay, now from the back, I'm going to take that little corner out first. So that's looking like it's sitting in there well now. So what we can do is go and reinstall our sockets, place it into position, and use the screws included in the kit to install that flush mount housing. So place that in. We can slot our Anderson back into the bottom of the housing, line those holes up with the bottom, and just start them with our finger. So just sit that back into position. You'll notice in your pack, along with the cable ties, there'll be a spare fuse and then our 4 black screws. So they're the ones we want to use to mount this housing into position. So as we put our first one in, we just want to make sure it's sitting nice and straight. Looks good. Then we can work our way around to do the other 3. Now that we've got that socket into position, if we've just got the single plus Anderson flush, that would be the end of our process of cutting out this panel. Because we're putting a secondary one in here, it's a little bit of a different process. We're just looking to use a hole saw. So perhaps a good idea to help us find a nice central location is using that collar that we've just taken off and just holding that basically where we want to put our socket. So we're going to try and aim for around the center of this section of the cutout and just get our central point there, lining it up with those two notches and these two notches, and just mark our center hole. Once we've done that, using a drill, we just want to drill our small pilot hole. And there's also an option that you could get 2 here as well and space them out, but in this case we've got 4 sockets in total. Once we've done our pilot drill, we can use either a stepper drill like this or a 32mm hole saw. So that's the diameter of our socket to go through there. Okay, so now that we've made our hole, we can insert our socket into place and do up the collar from the back side. So that's our sockets all installed into the panel. Now let's show you how to tackle the wiring from behind. So let's just run through 2 options now. The first option is just to leave this original Ford socket the way that Ford designed it, plugged into the Ford system and running off the main battery. If that's the case, what we want to do is use our little link wire to link positive from this socket to positive on that socket with our piggyback terminal sitting there. Same with the negative on that socket with our piggyback to negative on that socket. So that's our first option, and that'll make it all ready to connect into the harness we've already ran through to the rear compartment from our auxiliary battery. The next option is to add this socket into our dual battery system. Now what we want to do is get enough length on that cable to make sure that we can reach this socket here. So in this case, it's basically where Ford's gone from just wrapped cable to in sleeving. So what I'm going to do there is just cut that cable. We can do that because it's totally disconnected from Ford, so we can just cut that cable. Now I just want to separate these red and green wires for a moment. So just cutting that down with a blade or a pair of cutters and peeling it back to separate those 2 wires. Just strip the end of that wire, both of them, and that's why these terminals are included in the kit. So we're going to crimp 1 on each of these, and using a pair of crimpers preferably, we're going to crimp those terminals on. Also included in the pack with these terminals is 2 pieces of heat shrink. So I'm just going to bend those little tabs down a bit to allow the heat shrink to go on. This is just to insulate those terminals a little bit and to signify what's positive and what's negative. So just be sure that our red heat shrink, that's positive and that's on our red cable. Our black heat shrink, that's negative and that's on our green cable. So just using a little blowtorch or cigarette lighter, we're just going to shrink those little pieces down over the cables. So now that we've finished terminating the original Ford plug, it's ready to connect to this socket here. So it's as simple as putting the black one on the negative and just making sure our separate secondary lug is facing away, and same with the positive, red one on the positive, and the lug is facing out and away. That's just going to make it easier to connect our little link cables. So next, using the piggyback leads that were supplied in the kit, we just want to link one socket to the other. So going from that piggyback terminal there, we can link across to our other one. Same with the negative, linking to this terminal. We can sit that cable onto the negative of this socket. So we can either put a bit of tape around here, or using one of the cable ties supplied in the kit, we might just neaten that up by putting a cable tie around there. So that's fully prepared, our electrical panel for the installation into the car. Let's go back out to the car and show you how to make the final electrical connections. Okay, now it's time to make the electrical connections in the tub. Looking at the Anderson pins, you'll see little lips on the bottom. Now, that's designed to grab onto the metal tabs inside the Anderson. So what we're looking to do is our black negative's written on top of the Anderson plug there. We want to put that in that way with our lip on the bottom. So it's just a matter of pushing until we hear a click, like that. Give a pull, make sure it's in there tight. Just check again, positive. So we're going for our red one now, same thing. Push till we hear a solid click, like that. And we can check that by looking at the front of the Anderson and making sure that our terminals have actually grabbed onto that metal tab. Once that's happened, we know our Anderson is into position. Now all we need to do is use our piggybacks that come out of the Anderson to hook onto our last two terminals. The red one to the red terminal, black one to the black terminal. And what that does is then powers up all of our sockets, including the original Ford one. So now all 4 sockets are electrically connected. We can mount this panel back into position and then go and make the final electrical connections on the auxiliary battery. Let's place this panel back in and use the existing Ford bolts that we took out to place that panel back in to its original location. Okay, so our panel's fully reinstalled, ready to make our final connections onto the auxiliary battery. So now that our accessories have been mounted in the rear, it's time to get under the car and secure our harness all the way back to the auxiliary battery using the cable ties supplied in the kit. We'll see our harness coming straight down in between the inner wall and the outer wall of the tub. So it'll go straight across the top of the chassis rail where we can see that existing Ford electrical harness right near the spare tyre. So right from this point we can start securing our harness into position. I've just left a little bit of slack going up to the electrical panel, just in case we ever need to pull it out in the tub. We have a little bit of play. We don't want to have it super tight that we can't get it out. So just a little bit of slack there. And then I've got my first cable tie on. I'm just going to keep making my way down the Ford electrical harness. From this position, laying behind the rear wheel, I can make it to the fuel tank. So I've used 3 cable ties in that little section. I'm going to cut the tags off them. So now it's time to secure our harness. Laying in front of the rear wheel now, we've got the fuel tank right here. Looking towards the front of the vehicle, we have our harness already laying into position from earlier. So using the cable ties in the kit, we have that Ford harness running in between, or on top of the chassis rail, in between the fuel tank there. So we can see it through the gap. I can feel it. I can get my hand over the chassis rail. There's a lot of room here. So I'm getting into the position where I can see it up there, reaching over with a cable tie, and I can get both hands in there. So I'm placing the cable tie under the Ford harness, grabbing it with my finger, making sure our cable is sitting into place and locking that into position. So there's a cable tie on there. Following that same procedure all the way down, so just putting our harness in against that Ford harness. Once we get to the front of the fuel tank, it's quite accessible and visible. So here's the front of our fuel tank, here's our Ford harness, and this is our harness that we laid into position earlier. So you can see it's quite accessible, visible, easy access just to get some cable ties around. Now we're pretty much approaching the passenger seat area now, and you can see this harness heads across to the gearbox, so we can't really follow that anymore. What we do is have our harness, as we placed earlier, sitting across the top, coming to the back side of the chassis rail, or the outer edge of the chassis rail, and then we've got a new
forward electrical harness that we can follow. I'll put a cable tie on there and then we'll move the camera so you can see where we're talking about. So this is the cable tie I've just put on. So our harnesses come from the inside of the chassis rail to follow this electrical harness on the outside of the chassis rail. Same procedure, just cable tying to it as we go. So now we're facing the front on that electrical harness. It's our front wheel here. So just using more cable ties to route towards the front. Around our body mount here, we have our harness goes into a plastic shroud, so we can go around that plastic shroud. So making sure our cable goes across that body mount there, around the outside. And then in between the mudguard and that body mount, we can see more electrical harnesses. We can reach up and put a cable tie there. It's going to get us nice and secure for our run up the inside of the firewall from the engine bay. So now that we're secure all the way into the bottom of our run up through the firewall, it's just time to cut the tags off all of the cable ties that we've put on. So now we can head up to the engine bay and pull the rest of the cable up. So this is our harness that we've secured underneath the car. Now the next point, and this may change depending on accessories and where everything is in the engine bay, but there's a nice bracket here, steel bracket that's got a hole in it. So I'm going to put my first cable tie around here. Now just make sure that we stick away from these aircon aluminium lines, anything hot or moving, because we are in the engine bay now. So just be aware of where our cable's sitting, anywhere we can secure it to. So I've got this bracket, that's nice and secure. The next spot I want to aim for is the forward electrical harness again. So you'll notice there's a little bracket there. We could attach it to that or straight to the forward harness. I'm just going to put one through that little bracket for starters. And then straight on the harness. And that's just going to help me to sit it where I want it to sit. Once we've got those two secure, we can see our cables coming out here. Still that same forward electrical harness runs across the entire back of the engine against the firewall there. So we'll just continue securing to that. Depending on the route that we took to get to the rear, we may have a little bit of excess, or we may just have the exact right amount left. So we just want to make sure that if there's any excess, we just follow down and get rid of it by following those existing forward cables. But in this case, we've come up with a good length to go straight onto our battery connections. And that is actually the final step in this install. So we'll go and cut our cable ties off, and then we'll show you how to make the electrical connections onto your auxiliary battery. Okay, so now it's time to make our electrical connections to the auxiliary battery. So we've already wired up the red arc charger here, so it's just a matter of putting our cables over top of the existing cables. And this may change depending on the battery that you've chosen for your setup. Most deep cycle batteries will have like a stud, an 8mm stud here. So it's just a matter of placing our accessory harness over top of the existing red arc harness, doing up our terminal. Same thing on the positive. And doing that up as well. And the final step is just to secure our fuse holder. So we'll just lay it into position, sit it beside our red arc fuse holder, and just use a couple cable ties
to secure that into place next to the existing one. And then just cutting our cable tie tags and just making sure our harness is sitting nicely into position, using cable tie if need be to neaten these up. So now that we've made the electrical connections onto the auxiliary battery, we can go down the back and check that we have power to all of our sockets. So in this case, we've got our customer's gone for a USB socket that comes with a voltmeter, USB-C, USB-A. So we can straight away see that we have power to all of our sockets. So this vehicle is now ready to take away touring.